The Battle of the Sabis, also known as the Battle of the Samba or the Battle against the Nervians, was fought in 57 BC near modern Soulzois in northern France, between the legions of the Roman Republic and an association of Belgic tribes, principally the Nervii. Julius Caesar, commanding the Roman forces, was surprised and nearly defeated. According to Caesar's report, a combination of determined defense, skilled generalship, and the timely arrival of reinforcements allowed the Romans to turn a strategic defeat into a tactical victory. Prelude. During the winter of 58-57 BC, rumors came to Caesar's ears that the Belgic tribes were forming a union because they feared possible Roman interference in their affairs. The union included the Bellovaci, Suessionists, Nervii, Attribates, Ambiani, Marini, Menapi, Calea, Veliocuses, Viromandur, Aduatuci, Condrusi, Eburones, Keroezi, and Pimani tribes, and was under the leadership of Galba, a king of the Suessionists. These reports provided Caesar with a good pretext for conquering more than Gaul itself, and for this, he raised 2 legions in Cisalpine Gaul and convinced the Remi tribe to side with him. In response, the other Belgic and Celtic tribes had attacked Bibrax. Caesar countered by defending the Oppidum and winning an action at the Aisne. In the face of this and because of shortage of provisions, the union collapsed and tribal armies retreated to their own lands, with the agreed future intention of coming to the support of any tribe invaded by the Romans. Caesar continued his advance and tribes surrendered one by one. However, 4 tribes, the Nervii, the Attribates, the Aduatuci and the Viromandur, refused to submit. The Ambiani told Caesar that the Nervii were the most hostile of the Belgi to Roman rule, a fierce and brave tribe. They did not allow the import of luxury items as they believed these had a corrupting effect and probably feared Roman influence. They had no intention of entering peace negotiations with the Romans. Caesar would move on them next. Forces. As with all ancient battles, estimates of the forces available to both sides will always be a matter of some speculation. A Roman legion at this period had a theoretical establishment of some 4,800 fighting men with additional auxiliary forces. 8 Roman legions took part in the battle. It is not known if they were at full strength, but a reasonable estimate might be in the region of 42,000 men. Caesar claims he had earlier received intelligence from the Remi that the various tribes of the Belgi had promised to contribute a total of 300,000 fighting men. According to Caesar, the Remi estimates of the men promised by the 4 tribes now left to oppose Caesar were 50,000 Nervii, 15,000 Attribates, 10,000 Viromandur and 19,000 Aduatuci. If these figures were reliable, it would mean that Caesar was immediately faced with a maximum of 75,000 men, as the Aduatuci were still en route. Promises are not always kept, so it is probable the actual number was smaller than this, though still high enough to outnumber the legionaries. Order of battle: Caesar's legions. 7. 8. Ix triumphalis. Ex equestris. She. 12. Victrix. 13. 14. Traditionally it was believed that the battle was fought on the banks of the river Samba, near modern Aulnoy-Imères, but in 1955 Turquin showed that it was fought on the west bank of the river Selle, near modern Soulzois. Before the battle, Caesar's legions had been marching in Nervian territory for 3 days, following an ancient road. He learnt from prisoners that the Belgi were amassing on the far side of the river Sabis, which was about 10 miles ahead. The Nervii had persuaded the Attribates and the Viromandur to support them. The Aduatuci were marching to join them, but they did not arrive in time to take part in the battle. Their non-combatants had moved to a safe area screened by marshes, where an army could not approach. The Belgi had made their preparations and were now waiting for the Romans. Caesar sent forward experienced scouts to choose the next campsite. He learnt from prisoners taken later that sympathizers in the ragtag of surrendered Belgae and other Gauls traveling with the army had gone to the Nervii and reported his disposition of his column. They reported that the individual legionary baggage trains were interspersed between the legions and that it would be easy to cut off the leading legion from the rest and destroy it before any support could reach it. It was believed this would intimidate the Romans into withdrawing. The Nervii, having traditionally always relied on infantry rather than cavalry, had, over the years, developed a technique of building dense, impenetrable hedges of briars and thorns set between young trees as a defense against the raids of surrounding tribes. These would obstruct Caesar's advance and help the attack. It was agreed that the signal for an attack was to be the appearance of the baggage train behind the First Legion. In doing this, the Nervii were intending to use what is recognizable today as the modern army doctrine of force concentration. As will be seen, their plan would be frustrated by Caesar. Battle. The campsite was to be laid out on a hill which gently sloped down to the river. On the other side of the river there was another hill directly opposite, similarly sloping. The top of that hill was densely wooded, but the lower part was open and sloped down to the river over a distance of 200 paces. The enemy was concealed inside the woods, but a few cavalry pickets could be seen in the open area by the river. The river was very wide, but only about 3 feet deep. At some point on his march to the Sabis, Caesar reorganized the column and reverted to his usual tactic of leading his forces with 6 legions in light marching order. Behind them was the baggage column of the entire army, followed by the newly recruited legions, 13 and 14. Caesar does not say whether this change was fortuitous or was made in response to the intelligence received. While Caesar's force began to set up camp on the slope running down to the river, his cavalry, together with slingers and archers, was ordered to cross the river to reconnoiter. This developed into a skirmish with the few troops of Belgic cavalry that had been observed on the far side. Caesar describes the enemy cavalry as sallying repeatedly from the woods at the top of the hill and says his cavalry did not dare follow them in when they retreated. He does not elaborate further, so it will never be known if the Nervii were trying to entice the skirmishers onto their hidden position or holding them in play on the slopes in preparation for the planned rush. Meanwhile, the legions had started arriving at the campsite and began to build its fortifications. The Belgae, waiting for the baggage train to appear, gradually found themselves faced with not 1 legion, but 6. Their plan of piecemeal destruction had to be abandoned, but they must have believed their numbers more than adequate to deal with their enemy. Ambush. As the Roman baggage train came into view, the Belgic force suddenly rushed out of the trees and surprised their opponents, overwhelming the Roman cavalry. They crossed the shallow river at full speed and charged up the hill against the legions setting up camp, giving them no time to get into battle formation. It seemed to Caesar that the Nervii came on with incredible speed, all at once pouring out of the trees, charging across the river and overrunning his legionaries. Taken by surprise, Caesar had to rapidly give orders to sound the alarm, both by raising the battle standard and by trumpet. Get his men away from construction work, recall the wood-cutting parties and try to get his legions into some semblance of order. There was very little time and much had to be left undone. 2 things, though, saved the legions from being immediately routed. Firstly, the knowledge and experience of the soldiers, and secondly, Caesar had previously ordered all legion commanders to stay with their legions during the setting up of the camp. Caesar went wherever he was needed, giving only essential orders, and eventually found himself on the left wing with Legion 10. Seeing that the enemy were within range of the Romans, he gave the order to hurl a volley of spears. Going to another part of the field, he found his men already fighting. The men had run from their building tasks to fall into ranks, but many did not even have time to put on their helmets or take the covers off their shields. The legionaries had no opportunity to group with their own cohorts and instead congregated around the first friendly standard they saw, and the woody hilltop is the one place we can infer their presence. The soldiers of Legions X Equestris and IX Triumphalis, on the left flank, having thrown their spears at their Atrebates opponents, charged. They threw the enemy back and drove them into the river, killing many. The Romans crossed the river and found themselves on disadvantageous or uneven ground. But although the Atrebates regrouped and launched a counterattack, the Romans put them to flight a second time. Further along, in the center, 2 legions, Chianate, having checked the Viromandure with whom they were engaged, pushed them from the higher ground into the river. A compact column of Nervii under Boduanatus rushed through the opening. Part of the column turned to encircle the 2 legions holding the right flank. The rest continued upwards to attack the higher part of the camp. Crisis meanwhile. The routed Roman cavalry and skirmishers were just straggling into camp when they found themselves face to face with the Nervii. They ran again. Camp followers further up the hill by the camp's back gate had observed the success of the Romans at the river and came down in the hope of plunder, but noticed the Nervii in the camp and also ran. People accompanying the baggage train just arriving were horrified at the sight before them, and panicked as well. Even the usually dependable Treveri cavalry arriving to support the Romans looked at the seemingly hopeless situation and promptly turned for home to report the disaster. After encouraging Legion 10, Caesar went to the right wing. Things looked bad. He could see that the men of 12 Victrix were crammed so closely together in one mass by their standards that they could not fight effectively. All centurions of the 4th cohort were dead, its standard-bearer killed and the standard missing. Of the remaining cohorts, almost all the centurions were either wounded or killed. Baculus, the legion's primapilus, a fine soldier, had received so many minor and serious wounds that he could barely stand. The Nervii were attacking vigorously from lower ground and pressing at the front and both flanks. Caesar could see some men were shirking and trying to get to the rear, others were slowly ceasing effective resistance. There were no reserves. This was the crisis point. He took a shield from a soldier at the rear and went to the first line. Calling his centurions by name, he ordered them to have the soldiers advance and the maniples open up and extend. As he tells it, his arrival brought hope and boosted the soldiers' morale. Every man was now keen to do well in front of his general. As a result, the enemy assault was checked slightly. Recovery. Caesar saw that Legion 7 nearby was also hard-pressed. He ordered the tribunes to redeploy the 2 legions to gradually join and fight back-to-back. This further increased his men's confidence. By now, the legions escorting the baggage, having received a report of the action, had come on at double pace and the enemy could see them coming over the hill above the camp. Legion 10, under the legate Labienus, had overcome the Atrebates, crossed the river and defeated the Belgic reserves. Now they seized the Belgic camp on the wooded hill. From the higher ground, Labienus could see that Caesar's right wing was in serious trouble. He ordered his men back across the river to attack the Nervii from the rear. Soon Legions 13 and 14 joined the fight. Caesar does not detail their actions, but they probably cleared the camp and went to the right to relieve the pressure on Legions 12 and 7. This, coupled with the return of Legion 10, transformed the situation. Seeing the position begin to stabilize, cavalry and skirmishers took heart and, keen to wipe out their earlier shame, started to fight in earnest. The camp followers joined in now that they could see enemies' dismay. The entire Roman force was now fully committed. The Nervii warriors fought to the last, standing on the bodies of their slain comrades, and throwing the Romans' own spears back at them. Eventually the few remaining Nervii broke and fled the field. Caesar's opinion of the Nervii was that they had shown great fighting spirit in carrying an attack forward so vigorously onto difficult ground and in continuing to fight stubbornly when the tide of battle turned irretrievably against them. Casualties. The older men of the Nervii, described by Caesar as senators, came out of their hiding place in the marshland and surrendered. They said that their council had been reduced from 600 men to 3, and that of 60,000 fighting men there were barely 500 left. It is not entirely clear if this is a figure for the dead or if it includes wounded, nor is it clear if these are solely Nervii casualties or if the figure includes their allies. Caesar states that he spared the Nervii and ordered the surrounding tribes not to take advantage of their weakness. Caesar gives no indication of his own casualties. Aftermath. The Aduatuci turned for home as soon as they heard about the defeat. They were subsequently defeated by Caesar and some 53,000 of them sold into slavery. The Venetia, the Unelli, the Otomi, the Curiosolita, the Sesuvii, the Aulici and the Redanese were all brought under Roman control following the battle. In 54 BC, Ambiorix persuaded the Nervii to join the Eber ones after the latter had destroyed a legion and 5 cohorts under Sabinus and Cotta during the Ambiorix's revolt. During Vercingetorix's revolt, the Nervii were only asked to supply 5,000 men to the forces raised by a confederation of over 40 tribes. Literature. Pierre Turquin, La Bataille de la Selenelle, and 57 Avant J.C., in Les Études classiques 23 halves, 113 to 156.